17-year-old Terence Baldwin stands in the airport jetway, trembling as security escorts him away from Gate 14. His first-class boarding pass crumples in his shaking hand. Behind him, passengers whisper and record videos on their phones. In 30 minutes, his mother's private jet will land at this same airport. She has no idea her son just became a viral sensation for all the wrong reasons. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from right now. If you believe every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of how they look, go ahead and hit that like button. And make sure you subscribe because stories like this need to be heard. Trust me, what happens next will leave you absolutely speechless. Now, let's get into what really went down that morning at Charlotte Douglas International Airport. The morning started like any other dream coming true. Terence Baldwin walked through Terminal C at Charlotte Douglas International Airport at 6:45 in the morning, his heart racing with excitement rather than fear. He wore his debate team jacket with pride, the navy blue fabric displaying pins from regional and national competitions he'd won over the past 3 years. His backpack felt heavy with possibility, containing his laptop, the trophy from nationals he'd just won last month, and printed materials for his upcoming college tour at MIT. His mother had purchased the first-class ticket as a celebration gift, a reward for his academic achievements and a comfortable way to travel to Boston for what could be the most important visit of his young life. Gate 14 buzzed with the usual airport energy. Business travelers tapped away on laptops while families wrangled children and carry-on luggage. Terence approached the boarding desk with his phone displaying his mobile boarding pass, the words, "First Class, Seat 2A," clearly visible on the screen. He'd never flown first class before and couldn't wait to experience what his mother always described as the civilized way to travel. The gate agent, a woman whose name tag read Linda Pearson, looked up from her computer screen as he approached. Her expression shifted the moment her eyes landed on him, a subtle tightening around her mouth that Terence noticed but tried to dismiss. Linda's eyes traveled from his face down to his sneakers and back up again, lingering on every detail with an intensity that made Terence's skin crawl. She didn't smile or offer the polite greeting she'd given the 3 passengers who'd boarded just before him. Instead, she held out her hand for his phone with a gesture that felt more like a demand than a request. Terence handed it over, maintaining the polite composure his parents had drilled into him since childhood. Linda scanned the barcode once, then twice, then a third time. Her fingers moved to her computer keyboard, typing with sharp, deliberate strikes that seemed aggressive in their precision. The second stretched into a full minute. Behind Terence, other passengers began to form a line, their presence adding pressure to an already uncomfortable situation. Linda looked up from her screen, her lips pursed into a thin line of suspicion. Her voice carried across the gate area when she spoke, loud enough that nearby passengers turned to look. She asked him how he really obtained this ticket, the emphasis on the word "really" making it clear she doubted his explanation before he even gave it. The question hit Terence like a slap. He felt his face grow warm, that particular heat that comes from humiliation rather than anger, though anger was starting to simmer beneath the surface. Terence kept his voice steady and polite as he explained that his mother had purchased the ticket for his college tour at MIT. He pulled out his wallet and showed her his student ID, his driver's license, both clearly displaying his name matching the ticket exactly. Linda barely glanced at the identification before picking up her desk phone and calling for her supervisor. She spoke into the receiver about needing to verify a suspicious situation at Gate 14, her eyes never leaving Terence's face. The words, "suspicious situation," hung in the air like an accusation, and Terence felt the weight of every stare from the growing crowd of onlookers. Other first-class passengers continued to board around this uncomfortable scene. An elderly white couple walked past without so much as a glance at their tickets. A middle-aged white businessman in an expensive suit breezed through with just a nod. A young white woman with designer luggage received a warm smile and a cheerful, "Have a great flight," from Linda. Each boarding felt like another knife twisting in Terence's gut, the contrast impossible to ignore. He stood there, off to the side now, watching people who looked nothing like him waltz onto the plane without a single question while he remained stranded in this nightmare of scrutiny. The supervisor arrived within minutes, a tall man with graying hair whose name tag identified him as Craig Morrison. He didn't ask Terence for his side of the story or review the documentation already provided. Instead, he immediately adopted an aggressive tone that suggested Terence was already guilty of some unnamed crime. Craig demanded that Terence empty his pockets and his backpack right there in front of everyone, and the humiliation intensified to a level Terence had never experienced. His hands shook slightly as he complied, removing his phone, his wallet, some loose change, and a pack of gum from his pockets. He unzipped his backpack and began removing items one by one under Craig's watchful glare. Out came the laptop his parents had bought him for college. Out came the gleaming debate trophy with his name engraved on a brass plate. Out came his MIT acceptance letter, still in its folder, the pages he'd read 100 times now being examined by hostile strangers. Out came his student ID from his high school, showing his honor roll status and academic achievements. Each item told a story of success, of a young man on his way to great things, but Craig and Linda looked at these possessions as if they were evidence of theft rather than accomplishment. Craig picked up the acceptance letter, read it with raised eyebrows that suggested disbelief, and made a comment about how impressive it looked, the sarcasm dripping from every syllable. Despite all the evidence laid out before them proving Terence's identity and his legitimate right to that first-class seat, Craig insisted they needed to contact whoever really paid for the ticket. The implication was clear and insulting. Terence provided his mother's phone number, speaking each digit clearly despite the tremor in his voice. Craig wrote it down but immediately dismissed it as probably fake, not even bothering to dial before making that judgment. The final boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, the flight attendant's voice cheerful and oblivious to the drama unfolding at the gate desk. Time was running out, and Terence felt the situation spiraling beyond his control. Passengers had their phones out now, recording openly. Terence could see the red recording lights, could hear the whispered commentary as people narrated what they were witnessing. Some looked sympathetic, their faces showing discomfort with what was happening. Others looked suspicious, as if Craig and Linda must have good reason for their actions, as if Terence's skin color alone justified this treatment. The weight of those stares, those assumptions, those recordings that would follow him forever pressed down on his shoulders. He thought about his mother, about the conversations they'd had about staying composed under pressure, about not giving people ammunition to use against you. He forced back the tears that threatened to form, swallowed the angry words that wanted to explode from his chest, and maintained a dignity that no 17-year-old should have to summon in such circumstances. Craig Morrison stepped away from the desk and pulled his radio from his belt, the gesture deliberate and theatrical. He spoke into the device requesting airport security to Gate 14, citing a situation requiring immediate attention. The crackle of the radio response confirmed officers were on their way, and Terence felt his heart drop into his stomach. This was escalating beyond anything he could have imagined when he'd walked up to board his flight just 15 minutes earlier. His mind raced through everything his parents had taught him about interactions with authority, about keeping his hands visible, about staying calm, about not making sudden movements. At 17 years old, he shouldn't need to think about these things just to catch a flight, but here he was, running through a mental checklist of survival tactics. 2 security officers arrived within minutes, their presence drawing even more attention to the scene. Officer Davis, a white man in his 40s, approached with his hand resting casually on his belt near his equipment. The other officer, Hispanic and younger, followed half a step behind. They initially addressed the situation professionally, asking Craig what seemed to be the problem. Craig launched into an explanation that bore little resemblance to reality, describing Terence as evasive, claiming his story didn't add up, suggesting possible credit card fraud. Terence listened to these fabrications with growing disbelief and anger that he fought to keep from showing on his face. The officers turned their attention to Terence, their initial professionalism beginning to erode under Craig's influence. They asked him to step away from the gate area to discuss the situation privately, a request that sounded more like an order. Terence looked at the plane, so close yet impossibly far away, and then back at the officers. He knew refusing would only make things worse, so he nodded and followed them toward a glass-walled security office visible to everyone in the terminal. The walk felt endless, every step taking him further from his flight and deeper into a situation that seemed designed to strip away his dignity piece by piece. Inside the security office, the fluorescent lights felt harsh and interrogative. Through the glass walls, Terence could see passengers from his flight still boarding, the line dwindling as departure time approached. Craig followed them into the office, immediately dominating the conversation with more false claims about Terence's behavior. He described evasiveness that never happened, mentioned suspicious responses to questions Terence had answered directly and honestly, painted a picture of a young man up to no good. The officers listened, and Terence watched their body language shift, saw them start to view him through the lens of Craig's lies rather than the evidence right in front of them. Another airline staff member entered the office, a woman whose name tag identified her as Janet Rodriguez. Unlike Craig and Linda, Janet actually listened when Terence spoke. Her eyes moved between Terence's documentation and Craig's accusations, and something in her expression suggested she recognized the injustice unfolding. She proposed a simple solution, suggesting they call the credit card company to verify the purchase, which would take maybe 5 minutes and resolve everything. Craig immediately shot down this reasonable suggestion, insisting that what they were doing was standard security protocol for suspicious passengers. The way he said "suspicious" made it clear he meant something far more insidious than questionable tickets. The officers demanded Terence's phone to verify his mother's contact information themselves. Terence felt a spike of fear at this request, knowing his rights but also knowing that asserting them might be interpreted as having something to hide. He politely but firmly refused, explaining that he'd already provided the number and they were welcome to call it themselves, but he wouldn't hand over his personal device. He asked to speak with a supervisor above Craig, someone higher in the airport authority who might bring sanity to this insane situation. His refusal to surrender his phone and his request for higher authority were immediately twisted into evidence of non-compliance and suspicious behavior, as if standing up for basic rights equaled guilt. Craig's supervisor arrived, a woman named Amanda Chen whose crisp uniform and professional demeanor gave Terence a brief flash of hope. That hope died quickly when Amanda sided with Craig without hearing the full story, without reviewing the evidence, without questioning why a 17-year-old with a valid ticket and matching identification was being detained. She accepted Craig's version of events at face value, and Terence realized with sinking clarity that the color of his skin had predetermined the outcome of this situation long before he'd even approached the gate. The final boarding call for Flight 2847 to Boston echoed through the terminal. Terence's seat, 2A, remained empty while he stood in a security office surrounded by people who had decided he didn't belong in first class based on nothing but their own prejudices. Passengers from the flight pressed their faces against the terminal windows, filming the scene, their phones capturing every moment for social media posterity. The officers exchanged glances, and the younger one suggested taking Terence to a more secure location for further questioning, words that sent ice through Terence's veins. In a last desperate attempt to make someone see reason, Terence mentioned that his mother was Dr. Cassandra Baldwin, the CEO of TechVision Industries, one of the most successful technology companies in the nation. He said it not to name drop or sound important, but because surely the mention of such a prominent figure would make them pause and reconsider their actions. Craig's response was to laugh, a cruel sound that echoed in the small office. He said something dismissive about everyone claiming to have important relatives, adding sarcastically that he was the president and Linda was a movie star. The other adults in the room chuckled at his joke, and Terence felt something break inside him, some last piece of hope that justice would prevail in this situation. Outside the security office, a passenger named Michael Torres stood with his phone held high, live streaming the entire confrontation to his social media followers. Michael, a college student studying journalism, recognized injustice when he saw it and refused to be a silent bystander. His livestream title read, "Black Teen Being Removed from First-Class Flight for No Reason," and viewers flooded in by the hundreds, then thousands. Comments scrolled past faster than anyone could read them, a mix of outrage, support, and unfortunately, some racist assumptions that made Michael's blood boil. He kept filming, knowing that documentation was power, that without video evidence this story would become another he said she said situation where Terrence's truth would be dismissed. The video reached 10,000 views within the first 5 minutes. People shared it across platforms, adding their own commentary, their own experiences with racial profiling, their own fury at watching a young person be degraded simply for existing in a space where others didn't think he belonged. Hashtags began forming organically, spreading the story beyond Michael's immediate followers to a much wider audience. The power of social media meant that while Terrence stood trapped in that office, thousands of people around the country were watching, bearing witness, refusing to let this incident disappear into obscurity. A flight attendant from the Boston-bound plane, Derek Williams, noticed the commotion near the gate. Derek, a black man in his early 30s who'd worked for the airline for 8 years, had seen this movie before. He'd witnessed the subtle and not-so-subtle ways passengers of color were treated differently, had experienced it himself on occasions when he traveled as a passenger rather than crew. Something in his gut told him this situation at Gate 14 was wrong, and he made the decision to get involved despite the potential consequences to his career. Derek approached the security office with the authority of someone in uniform, someone who belonged in this space. He knocked on the glass door and entered without waiting for permission, his employee badge visible and granting him access. He took in the scene quickly, his experienced eyes cataloging the power dynamics, the fear on Terrence's face, the aggressive postures of Craig and the security officers. Derek addressed Craig directly, keeping his tone professional but firm. He said he'd worked thousands of flights and seen passengers of all types, and this young man clearly posed no threat or problem. He vouched for Terrence based on nothing but his professional judgment and moral compass, trying to inject sanity into an insane situation. Craig's response was immediate and threatening. He turned on Derek with fury, accusing him of interfering with security procedures, suggesting he was jeopardizing his job by getting involved in matters that didn't concern him. Craig pulled rank, mentioned connections to Derek's supervisors, made thinly veiled threats about employment termination if Derek didn't back off immediately. The message was clear: stay in your lane, don't rock the boat, don't stand up for what's right if it means challenging authority. Derek held Craig's gaze for a long moment, and Terrence could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Derek had a family to support, bills to pay, a career he'd built over nearly a decade. The risk was real and substantial. Derek backed off physically, stepping toward the door, but before he left he made eye contact with Terrence. In that look passed a world of understanding, of shared experience, of solidarity that words couldn't capture. Derek mouthed the words, "Stay strong," and gave the slightest nod, and Terrence felt less alone than he had moments before. Sometimes knowing that someone else sees the injustice, that you're not crazy for recognizing it, makes all the difference in the world. Derek's brief intervention didn't change the immediate outcome, but it planted a seed that would grow into something larger. Amanda Chen made her final decision with the cold efficiency of someone more concerned about liability than justice. She announced that Terrence would not be permitted to board the flight, that his ticket would be refunded, and that this was the end of the discussion. When Terrence asked for specific examples of the disruptive behavior he'd allegedly exhibited, she provided only circular reasoning and vague references to security protocols. The truth was there were no specific examples because there had been no disruptive behavior, but admitting that would mean admitting they were wrong, and people in positions of authority rarely take that step willingly. Craig jumped in with legal terminology clearly meant to intimidate rather than inform. He mentioned trespassing charges, federal aviation regulations, the possibility of being placed on a no-fly list. Each phrase was designed to scare Terrence into compliance, into accepting this injustice quietly so they could all move on with their days. Craig even had the audacity to suggest that Terrence should be grateful they weren't pressing charges, as if he should thank them for the privilege of only being humiliated and denied service rather than arrested. Through the glass walls, Terrence watched the flight door close. He saw the jet bridge pull away from the aircraft, watched the plane begin its pushback from the gate. His flight to Boston, to MIT, to his future, departed without him. The finality of it hit him like a physical blow. He'd done everything right, followed every rule, maintained his composure, and still the system had crushed him. The gate area began to empty as passengers dispersed to other flights and destinations, leaving Terrence standing in an office with people who saw him as a problem solved rather than a person wronged. Janet Rodriguez had remained quiet during most of the confrontation, but as the situation concluded she made a choice that would prove significant. She approached Terrence quietly while Craig and Amanda were busy congratulating themselves on handling the situation. Janet pressed her business card into his hand and whispered that she'd recorded parts of the interaction on her phone and had already sent the files to corporate headquarters. She told him this wasn't right, that she was sorry, that someone needed to speak up. Her small act of rebellion wouldn't undo what had happened, but it represented another crack in the wall of silence that allows injustice to thrive. The airport PA system crackled to life, announcing the arrival of an incoming private aircraft to the executive terminal. Terrence barely registered the announcement, too overwhelmed by his own situation to connect it to his mother's early return from her conference. He didn't know that half a mile away, his mother's private jet was touching down on the runway. He couldn't imagine that the woman who'd built an empire from nothing was about to bring the full force of her power, her connections, and her righteous fury to bear on the people who'd hurt her son. Finally alone in the now empty gate area, Terrence allowed himself to sink to the floor, his back against a pillar, his carefully maintained composure crumbling. The full weight of humiliation crashed over him in waves. He'd been accused of being a thief, a liar, someone who didn't belong. He'd been investigated, interrogated, and ultimately rejected from a space he'd paid to occupy. The tears he'd fought so hard to contain finally spilled over, and he didn't try to stop them. Sometimes you have to let yourself feel the pain before you can process it and move forward. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket. Terrence pulled it out to find 73 missed calls from his mother and dozens of text messages asking if he'd boarded okay, if he was excited, if he wanted her to meet him in Boston. Each message was a reminder of the conversation he now had to have, the disappointment and worry he'd cause when he told her what happened. He couldn't bring himself to call her back yet, couldn't bear to hear the concern in her voice or worse, the recognition. She would know immediately what had really happened, would understand the subtext beneath whatever sanitized version he tried to tell. She'd fought these battles her entire life and had hoped her son might face fewer of them, but hope doesn't change reality. Half a mile from the main terminal, in the private executive aviation section of Charlotte Douglas International Airport, a sleek Gulfstream G650 taxied to a stop. The aircraft bore the logo of TechVision Industries, a company that had revolutionized data security and made its founder one of the most powerful women in American business. Dr. Cassandra Baldwin stepped out of the plane onto the tarmac, her designer business suit immaculate despite hours of travel, her natural hair styled in elegant locks that had become part of her signature look. At 42, she'd achieved what many spend lifetimes chasing, building a billion-dollar enterprise from a startup she'd launched in her MIT dorm room 20 years earlier. Cassandra had left her conference in Seattle a day early, eager to surprise her son before his MIT campus tour. She'd been looking forward to showing him around her alma mater, introducing him to professors who'd mentored her, sharing stories of her own college experience. Her assistant James met her at the plane stairs with her usual post-flight briefing, tablet in hand displaying emails that needed attention and schedule updates. But instead of the normal business updates, James's face showed concern. He handed her the tablet without his usual summary, simply saying she needed to see something immediately. The video playing on the screen made Cassandra's blood run cold. She recognized her son instantly despite the poor camera angle and the crowd of people partially blocking the view. She watched Terrence stand with quiet dignity while being interrogated by airline staff and security. She saw his belongings spread across a desk like evidence at a crime scene. She heard the dismissive tone, the accusations, the casual cruelty of people abusing their small measure of power. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the tablet, not from weakness but from the effort of containing rage that threatened to explode. Cassandra watched the full 7-minute video without speaking, her expression transforming from shock to something harder and more dangerous. James knew that look. He'd seen it in boardrooms when competitors underestimated her, in negotiations when someone tried to cheat her company, in moments when Cassandra shifted from successful businesswoman to force of nature. She handed the tablet back and immediately pulled out her phone, dialing Terrence's number with fingers that had steadied into focus. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and she imagined all the reasons he might not answer, each one worse than the last. Terrence finally picked up on the 4th ring, and the sound of his voice, thick with tears he was trying to hide, nearly broke her. Cassandra's maternal instincts screamed at her to comfort, to soothe, to make the hurt go away, but her strategic mind knew that wasn't what this moment required. She kept her voice calm and asked him to tell her exactly what happened, from the beginning, every detail he could remember. As Terrence recounted the story, Cassandra took notes on her phone, building a timeline, cataloging names, identifying points of legal vulnerability. She operated simultaneously as mother and CEO, love and fury driving her in equal measure. While Terrence talked, Cassandra put him on speaker and dialed her legal team on another line, bringing her attorneys into a conference call within minutes. She gave them the abbreviated version, sent them the viral video link, instructed them to begin building a case immediately. Her lawyers knew better than to suggest she was overreacting or should wait to cool down. They'd seen Cassandra Baldwin in action before and knew that when she set her mind to holding someone accountable, she didn't stop until justice was served. They began making their own calls, pulling relevant case law, researching precedents for discrimination lawsuits against airlines. Cassandra's next call went to the airport director's emergency line, a number reserved for genuine crises. When a subordinate answered, Cassandra identified herself fully, dropping the names of her company, her Forbes ranking, and several board positions she held at major corporations. She demanded an immediate meeting with the highest-ranking official available and made it clear this wasn't a request. The voice on the other end stammered something about checking availability, and Cassandra cut through the bureaucratic nonsense with surgical precision. She had documentation of her son being racially profiled and illegally denied service, the video had already gone viral with millions of views, and if she didn't have someone in authority in front of her within the hour, her next call would be to every major news network in the country. Suddenly, availability opened up. Her driver waited at the executive terminal with her usual car, ready to take her to MIT for the surprise visit she'd planned. Cassandra redirected him to Terminal C instead, to Gate 14, to her son who needed her more than any campus tour. During the short drive between terminals, she made more calls. She contacted the airline CEO, a man she'd met at several industry conferences, someone who considered himself a friend and ally. She informed him of the situation with the cold precision of someone presenting evidence, not asking for favors. His horror sounded genuine over the phone, his promises to investigate immediate and emphatic, but Cassandra had been in business long enough to know that words were cheap and actions were what mattered. James pulled up additional information on his tablet, doing the kind of rapid research that made him invaluable. He found employment records for Linda Pearson, Craig Morrison, and Amanda Chin. He discovered that Craig had 3 previous complaints of racial discrimination filed against him by black passengers, all of which had been dismissed by his supervisors as misunderstandings or passengers being oversensitive. The pattern was clear and damning, evidence that this wasn't an isolated incident but part of a systemic problem the airline had chosen to ignore. Cassandra filed this information away, ammunition for the battle ahead. The weight of failure pressed on Cassandra's shoulders as the car navigated through airport traffic. She'd built an empire, broken glass ceilings, appeared on magazine covers as a symbol of black excellence and female empowerment. She'd given speeches about overcoming obstacles and creating opportunities. And yet she hadn't been able to protect her own son from the racism she'd fought her entire life. She thought about the conversations she'd had with Terrence over the years, the talks every black parent has with their children about staying safe, about how to interact with police and authority figures, about the unfairness of being judged by skin color before character. Intellectual preparation couldn't shield him from the emotional impact of experiencing that hatred firsthand. The car pulled up to Terminal C, and Cassandra stepped out with the focused intensity of a general heading into battle. Airport Director Marcus Webb met her at the VIP entrance, his nervous energy palpable. He offered apologies before even hearing the full story, his words tumbling over each other in an attempt to placate her. Cassandra cut through his rambling with a single question that silenced him completely. "Where is my son, and who authorized his removal from a paid first-class seat?" The question hung in the air, demanding an answer that Marcus clearly didn't want to give. "Now, before we continue, I need you to do something for me. Comment number 1 if you think Dr. Baldwin has every right to bring the full force of her power down on these people who humiliated her son. And if you've ever experienced or witnessed discrimination like this, hit that like button to show your support for everyone fighting against racial injustice. Subscribe to this channel because we're not done yet, not even close. What do you think happens when a mother with unlimited resources and connections discovers her child has been violated? Do you think Craig and Linda have any idea what's about to hit them? Stay with me because the next part will restore your faith that sometimes, just sometimes, people are held accountable for their actions. Marcus Webb led Cassandra through the terminal corridors with the nervous energy of someone who knew his job was on the line. They arrived at the security office where Craig, Linda, and Amanda waited, unaware that the storm they'd created was about to crash down on their heads with devastating force. The three of them looked up as Cassandra entered, and their initial expressions showed no recognition, no understanding of who stood before them. They saw another black woman, probably the boy's mother, someone they assumed they could handle with the same dismissive authority they'd used on her son. Craig started talking immediately, launching into what he clearly thought was a reasonable explanation of security protocols and passenger behavior standards. He used bureaucratic language and policy numbers, speaking slowly as if explaining something complicated to someone simple. Cassandra let him continue, her face an unreadable mask, her phone recording every word. She'd learned long ago that sometimes the best strategy was to let people dig their own graves with their own shovels. Craig dug enthusiastically, adding details about Terrence's supposed evasiveness, his failure to comply, the suspicious nature of an expensive first-class ticket for someone so young. When Craig finally finished his presentation, clearly pleased with himself, Cassandra allowed a moment of silence to settle over the room. Then she introduced herself with the full weight of her accomplishments and authority. Dr. Cassandra Baldwin, CEO and founder of TechVision Industries, Forbes' Most Powerful Women in Tech No. 47, MIT graduate with dual degrees in computer science and business, board member of 3 Fortune 500 companies, and most relevantly, the mother of the young man they just illegally denied service and publicly humiliated. She watched the color drain from their faces, saw the exact moment they realized the magnitude of their mistake. Cassandra pulled out her phone and began displaying documentation with the systematic precision of someone building a legal case, which is exactly what she was doing. Here's the receipt for the first-class ticket purchased on my credit card 3 weeks ago. Here's the confirmation email sent to my company email address. Here's my credit card statement showing the charge. Here's my corporate identification proving I am exactly who I say I am. She laid out each piece of evidence like a prosecutor in court, her voice never rising, her demeanor never losing its professional polish. Rage channeled through ice-cold precision was far more effective than heated emotions. She demanded to see the incident reports Craig and Amanda had filed, the official documentation of this supposed security threat that had required removing a 17-year-old from his flight. They hesitated, exchanged glances, clearly reluctant to hand over documents they knew would incriminate rather than exonerate them. Cassandra didn't ask twice. She informed them that her legal team was already preparing subpoenas that would get those documents anyway, along with every email, memo, and piece of security footage from the past 6 hours. They could hand them over now and at least appear cooperative, or they could wait for the legal process to extract them forcibly. The reports appeared within seconds. Reading through the incident reports felt like entering an alternate reality. The documents described a passenger who was belligerent, evasive, threatening, and uncooperative. They painted a picture of someone who bore no resemblance to Terrence or to the young man captured in the viral videos that now had over 2 million views. Cassandra cross-referenced the written reports with the timestamps from the videos, pointing out the exact moments when the reports claimed Terrence was being aggressive while the video clearly showed him standing quietly with his hands visible. She dismantled their fabrications with the thoroughness of someone used to exposing corporate fraud. Linda attempted to defend her actions, her voice taking on a whining quality as she insisted she was just doing her job, following protocols, keeping passengers safe. Cassandra listened to this defense and then pulled up statistics she'd had James compile during the drive over. In the past year, Linda had flagged 87 passengers for additional screening at this gate. 76 of those passengers were people of color. 63 were black. Only 11 were white, and of those 11, 9 were traveling with people of color. The numbers told a story that Linda's words tried desperately to obscure. Craig tried a different approach, invoking airline policy and employee discretion, suggesting that gate agents had the authority to refuse boarding to anyone who made them uncomfortable. Cassandra had anticipated this defense and had the actual airline policy pulled up on her phone. She quoted it verbatim, the specific sections that outlined the legitimate reasons for denying boarding, none of which applied to Terrence's situation. She pointed out the clauses that explicitly prohibited discrimination based on race, appearance, or subjective comfort levels. She noted the requirement for supervisory approval before removing a passenger, approval that should have come from someone above Amanda's level. They'd violated their own policies at multiple points. Amanda Chin attempted to salvage the situation with corporate speak, offering sincere apologies for any misunderstanding, suggesting perhaps there had been miscommunication, proposing a voucher for future travel as compensation. Cassandra's response was sharp enough to draw blood. This wasn't a misunderstanding, and it certainly wasn't about vouchers or compensation. This was racial profiling, false imprisonment, defamation, and violation of federal civil rights statutes. She listed the specific laws they'd broken, the Title VI violations, the Civil Rights Act breaches, the potential federal charges that could result from filing false reports. She informed them that her legal team was currently filing complaints with the FAA, the Department of Transportation, and the Department of Justice. She would be pursuing civil litigation for damages, not because she needed the money but because financial consequences were often the only language corporations understood. But more than that, she was demanding systemic change. Mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees. Independent review of all incidents Craig had been involved in over his entire tenure. Policy reforms that included real accountability and oversight. An end to the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place. Marcus Webb tried to position himself as a neutral mediator, offering platitudes about taking this seriously and conducting thorough investigations. Cassandra shut that down immediately, pointing out that the airport had conducted thorough investigations of the previous complaints against Craig and found nothing wrong each time. The problem wasn't the investigations but the institutional blindness that made people in power unable to see discrimination even when it was documented. She wanted independent oversight, third-party auditors, transparency that couldn't be manipulated by internal politics. Janet Rodriguez was brought into the office, still carrying the weight of having witnessed injustice and chosen to document it rather than stay silent. She provided her recordings and a written statement she'd prepared, knowing it might cost her job but unable to live with herself if she said nothing. Her testimony corroborated everything Terrence had said and contradicted the official reports at every turn. Cassandra made a mental note to ensure Janet faced no retaliation for her integrity, to offer her a job at TechVision if the airline proved vindictive. Derek Williams appeared next, having finished his flight duties and heard about the confrontation happening in the security office. He added his statement to the growing pile of evidence, revealing that Craig's behavior wasn't isolated to this incident. Derek shared stories of other passengers, other situations where Craig had demonstrated clear bias. He provided names and dates, specific enough that they could be investigated and verified. Other employees began coming forward too, emboldened by Derek and Janet's courage, sharing their own experiences of witnessing discrimination and being told to look the other way. The corporate representative from airline headquarters arrived, a vice president of operations who clearly wished he was anywhere else. He reviewed the evidence, listened to the statements, watched portions of the viral videos that were still accumulating views by the second. His assessment was swift and definitive. He announced the immediate suspension pending investigation of Craig, Linda, and Amanda. He authorized Cassandra to make a public statement on behalf of the airline if she chose. He committed to implementing every reform she demanded and invited her to be part of the oversight committee that would monitor compliance. Media had gathered outside the terminal, news crews setting up cameras and lights, reporters checking their notes and preparing for live shots. The story had exploded beyond social media into mainstream news, with every major network covering the viral video and the airline's response. Cassandra glanced at the growing media circus and made a decision. Before she spoke to any reporters, before she made any public statements, she needed to find her son. Everything else could wait. Terrence came first. Cassandra found Terrence exactly where Marcus had said he'd be, still sitting in the empty gate area where his flight had departed hours earlier. He sat with his back against a pillar, his knees drawn up, his debate team jacket bunched around him like armor that had failed to protect him when it mattered most. The sight of her son, her brilliant, kind, accomplished son reduced to this defeated posture, nearly shattered the professional composure Cassandra had maintained throughout the confrontation. But she knew that what Terrence needed now wasn't her rage at the system but her presence as his mother. She didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside him on the airport floor, her expensive suit wrinkling against the industrial carpet. Her presence spoke what words couldn't, a silent promise that he wasn't alone, that she was here, that whatever came next they would face it together. They sat in that silence for a long moment, and then Terrence turned toward her and the dam broke. He collapsed into her arms and cried with the kind of raw, gasping sobs that come from deep hurt finally finding a safe space to be expressed. Cassandra held her son and let him cry, one hand rubbing his back the way she had when he was small and fell off his bike or woke from nightmares. Except this wasn't a skinned knee or a bad dream. This was the nightmare of reality, the moment when the abstractions of racism became concrete and personal. She didn't try to stop his tears or tell him everything would be okay. She just held him and let him feel what he needed to feel, understanding that healing couldn't begin until the wound was acknowledged. When the initial wave of emotion passed, Terrence pulled back, wiping his face with the sleeve of his jacket. He started apologizing, his words tumbling over each other, saying he was sorry for causing trouble, for making her leave her conference early, for becoming a viral video that would embarrass her company. Cassandra stopped him firmly, her hands on his shoulders, her eyes locked with his. She told him in words that left no room for argument that he had done nothing wrong, that the system had failed him, that the fault belonged entirely to the people who judged him by his skin rather than his character. They talked through what had happened, Terrence sharing details too painful to say over the phone, moments of humiliation that cut deeper because of their casual cruelty. Cassandra listened to every word, her anger at Craig and Linda and Amanda growing with each revelation but her expression remaining calm for her son's sake. She needed him to feel heard and supported, not to carry the additional burden of her emotions on top of his own. Cassandra shared her own experiences, stories Terrence had heard before but that hit differently now. She told him about being followed in high-end stores despite wearing designer clothes and carrying a purse worth more than the security guard's monthly salary. She described being questioned about her car in the parking lot of her own office building, with security refusing to believe she belonged there. She recalled the time she'd been escorted out of a luxury hotel where she was actually the evening's keynote speaker, with staff assuming she was trespassing rather than a guest. She explained that her success hadn't made her immune to racism, and his achievements wouldn't either. No amount of education or accomplishment could fully shield them from people who chose to see skin color before humanity. But she emphasized that this reality wasn't a reason to give up or accept injustice. It was exactly why they had to fight back, demand better, create change so that maybe the next generation would face fewer battles. Progress happened when people refused to accept the unacceptable, when they turned pain into purpose and trauma into transformation. Terence asked the question every black child eventually asks their parents, the one that has no good answer. Would it always be this way? Would he spend his whole life having to prove he belonged, having to work twice as hard for half the recognition, having to maintain perfect composure while being treated with casual contempt? Cassandra was honest with him, refusing to offer false hope or empty platitudes. She told him the fight continued, that racism was a systemic poison that wouldn't be cured quickly or easily. But she also told him about progress, about the changes she'd seen in her lifetime, about battles won and ground gained through the collective action of people who refused to stay silent. She pulled out her phone and showed him the social media response, thousands upon thousands of supportive messages flooding in from around the world. People of all races expressing outrage at his treatment, sharing their own stories of discrimination, pledging support for accountability and change. Civil rights organizations had already reached out, offering legal assistance and platform amplification. The video that documented his humiliation was also documenting the collective refusal to accept such treatment, turning a moment of injustice into a catalyst for action. Terence realized that his experience, as painful as it was, might prevent someone else from going through the same thing. If his humiliation led to policy changes, if it made even one gate agent think twice before profiling a passenger, if it encouraged others to speak up rather than stay silent, then maybe some good could come from this terrible day. The idea didn't erase the hurt, but it provided a framework for processing it, a way to channel pain toward purpose. They discussed what came next, the press conference that Cassandra's team was already organizing, the legal actions being prepared, the demands for systemic change. Terence was hesitant about the media attention, worried about becoming defined by this incident, about being forever known as that kid, rather than being seen for his accomplishments and potential. Cassandra understood his concern and made it clear that the choice was his. She would support whatever he decided, whether that meant speaking publicly or staying private while she handled the public-facing aspects. After thinking it through, Terence made his decision. He would speak out, not for revenge but for change. He didn't want other kids to go through what he'd experienced. He didn't want Craig to continue treating passengers the way he treated him. He didn't want the airline to sweep this under the rug with a quiet settlement and no real accountability. If his voice could make a difference, he needed to use it, even if the attention made him uncomfortable. His mother had taught him that privilege came with responsibility, and the platform this incident had given him was a form of privilege he couldn't waste. They strategized together, mother and son, CEO and future leader, mapping out key points Terence wanted to make, identifying the messages that mattered most. Cassandra took notes on her phone, already thinking about how to support his goals while protecting his well-being. She suggested concrete policy changes based on his experience, asking him what would have made a difference in the moment. Terence had insights born from living through the situation, practical suggestions about transparency, accountability, and oversight that came from the perspective of someone who'd been failed by the current system. Terence remembered Janet and Derek, the two employees who'd risked their jobs to stand up for what was right. He asked his mother to make sure they were protected, that their integrity didn't result in retaliation or career damage. Cassandra promised to handle that personally, already planning to recognize their courage publicly and ensure they had opportunities rather than consequences for their moral stance. People who stood up against injustice deserve support, not punishment, and she would use her influence to guarantee that outcome. The airport conference room had been hastily prepared for media, with a podium, microphones, and a backdrop featuring airport and airline logos that would soon be associated with a very different story than they'd intended. Dr. Cassandra Baldwin stood at the podium with her son beside her, his presence a deliberate choice to put a human face on statistics about discrimination. Major news outlets packed the room, cameras pointing at them from every angle, reporters with notebooks and recorders ready to capture every word. Social media live streams multiplied the audience exponentially, with hundreds of thousands tuning in to watch the press conference in real time. Cassandra delivered her opening statement with the controlled power of someone used to commanding boardrooms and conference stages. She outlined what had happened to Terrence with factual precision, presenting the timeline, the evidence, the pattern of discrimination that this incident revealed. She played portions of the viral video on screens around the room, forcing everyone to watch the casual cruelty, the baseless accusations, the humiliation inflicted on a teenager whose only crime was being black in a first-class boarding line. The footage spoke for itself, requiring no embellishment or interpretation. She framed the incident within the broader context of systemic racism in the travel industry, pulling up statistics that made the room uncomfortable with their implications. Black passengers were 3 times more likely to be subjected to additional screening than white passengers. Complaints of discrimination were filed regularly but rarely resulted in meaningful consequences for the employees involved. Training programs existed on paper but were often treated as formalities to check off rather than genuine opportunities for growth and change. The numbers painted a picture of an industry that talked about diversity but failed to address its own biases. Cassandra shared data from Department of Transportation reports, highlighting the gap between complaints filed and investigations completed, between investigations completed and actions taken. She presented charts showing the percentage of discrimination complaints that resulted in employee discipline versus the percentage that were dismissed as misunderstandings or lack of evidence. The disparity was stark and damning, evidence that the system protected itself rather than the passengers it claimed to serve. Then she introduced Terrence, stepping back from the podium to let him speak in his own words. Terrence approached the microphone with visible nervousness, his hands shaking slightly before he clasped them together. But when he began to speak, his voice was clear and steady, strengthened by the conviction that his words mattered. He described feeling subhuman, treated as suspicious before he'd said a word or made a gesture, judged entirely on his appearance rather than his actions or character. He explained what it felt like to be questioned about belonging in a space he'd paid for, to have his possessions examined like evidence of crime, to watch other passengers board without scrutiny while he stood detained. He emphasized that he wasn't unique, that this happened daily to black travelers across America, that his story was being amplified because of his mother's prominence but thousands of other stories went unheard because the victims lacked platforms or resources. He thanked the allies, specifically naming Janet and Derek, who'd risked their jobs to stand for what was right. He said that change required people with privilege and position to use their advantages on behalf of those with less, to speak up when they witnessed injustice rather than looking away to protect their comfort. The question and answer session grew intense quickly, with reporters asking about the lawsuit, potential settlements, criminal charges against Craig for filing false reports. Cassandra fielded these questions with the skill of someone who'd faced hostile press before, providing enough information to satisfy while protecting legal strategies still under development. She confirmed that civil litigation was proceeding, that criminal referrals had been made to appropriate authorities, that her team was pursuing every avenue for accountability within both legal and regulatory frameworks. Then she made an announcement that shifted the entire conversation. She was funding a new nonprofit organization called the Equitable Skies Initiative, dedicated to providing legal support for travelers facing discrimination. The organization would offer free legal representation for those who couldn't afford attorneys, would conduct independent audits of airline diversity and bias training programs, and would work directly with the FAA on policy reforms to prevent future incidents. She committed $10 million of her personal wealth to launch the initiative and pledged to raise additional funds from other corporate leaders who wanted to be part of the solution. The airline's representative, a new vice president brought in specifically to handle this crisis, made a statement that acknowledged failures and committed to change. He announced the immediate suspension of Craig, Linda, and Amanda pending the completion of a thorough investigation. He outlined new protocols Cassandra had suggested, including mandatory bias training with regular refresher courses, independent monitoring of screening patterns to identify potential discrimination, and a simplified complaint process that bypassed supervisors potentially invested in protecting problematic employees. He committed to quarterly diversity reports that would be made public, creating transparency and accountability that had been absent before. The airport director pledged similar reforms across all terminals, recognizing that this problem extended beyond one gate or one airline. He announced partnerships with civil rights organizations to develop better training materials and assessment tools. He committed to hiring independent auditors who would review screening patterns and flag potential issues before they resulted in incidents like Terence's. The promises sounded good, and Cassandra would make sure they translated into action rather than remaining empty words designed to calm public outrage. Social media exploded in real time as the press conference progressed. The hashtag Justice for Terence trended nationally, with celebrities, activists, politicians, and ordinary people expressing support and sharing their own experiences. Other passengers came forward with eerily similar stories, describing the same gate agents, the same patterns, the same dismissal of their complaints. The movement grew beyond this one incident, becoming a broader conversation about discrimination in travel, about who gets believed and who gets questioned, about the everyday humiliations people of color face in spaces that should be equally accessible to all. Some backlash emerged from predictable sources, people who insisted Terence must have done something to deserve suspicion, who defended the gate agents' right to trust their instincts, who claimed any mention of racism was playing the race card. But these voices were drowned out by overwhelming support, by the video evidence that made denial impossible, by the pattern of behavior that showed this wasn't about one teenager's attitude but about systemic bias that had been allowed to flourish unchecked. Derek and Janet were publicly recognized during the press conference, with both the airline and Cassandra acknowledging their courage in coming forward. The airline committed to protecting whistleblowers, establishing clearer procedures for reporting discrimination they witnessed, and ensuring that doing the right thing wouldn't result in career consequences. Derek would become the lead trainer for new anti-discrimination protocols, using his experience and credibility to create real change. Janet was promoted to a newly created position in passenger advocacy, given authority to investigate complaints and recommend actions without having to go through the supervisory chain that had protected Craig. Major civil rights organizations issued statements of support, offering their resources and expertise to the Equitable Skies initiative. The NAACP, the National Urban League, and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights all pledged partnership, recognizing that transportation access was a civil rights issue that demanded coordinated action. Their support lent additional weight and legitimacy to Cassandra's efforts, connecting this individual incident to the broader movement for racial justice. Other Black professionals began sharing their own airport discrimination stories, creating a wave of testimony that made the scope of the problem impossible to ignore. A doctor described being questioned about her first-class ticket despite wearing hospital scrubs with her credentials clearly visible. An attorney recounted being pulled aside for additional screening so frequently that he'd started arriving at airports hours early to account for the delays. A professor shared experiences of having her academic materials examined with suspicion, as if her research papers might be evidence of criminal activity. Each story added to the mounting evidence that this wasn't about individual bad actors but about patterns woven into the fabric of how travel operated in America. The conversation expanded beyond airports to other spaces where Black people faced discrimination, from retail stores to restaurants to professional settings. Terence's incident became a catalyst for broader discussions about racial profiling, about the exhausting labor of proving you belong, about the psychological toll of constant scrutiny. The media coverage shifted from just reporting on one teenager's experience to examining systemic issues that affected millions of people daily. Fortune 500 CEOs reached out to Cassandra, some genuinely interested in collaborating on corporate bias training, others motivated by fear that their companies might be next in the spotlight. Cassandra took meetings with all of them, able to distinguish between authentic commitment and performative allyship. She accepted partnerships that came with concrete commitments and accountability measures while politely declining those that seemed more focused on protecting corporate image than creating real change. Terence received messages from thousands of other teenagers, many of them sharing their own experiences of discrimination, expressing gratitude that someone with a platform was speaking about issues they faced in silence. Young people of color especially found hope in seeing someone their age refuse to accept injustice quietly, showing that youth didn't mean powerlessness. Terence read as many messages as he could, responding when possible, humbled and overwhelmed by the trust people placed in him by sharing their stories. 2 weeks after the press conference, the results of the independent investigation were released to the public, and the findings were even more damning than initial reports had suggested. Craig Morrison was terminated immediately, his employment ending with cause that would make future jobs in the industry difficult to obtain. The investigation revealed a pattern of discrimination spanning his entire 5 years with the airline, with 15 previous incidents documented where passengers of color had been subjected to scrutiny that their white counterparts never faced. Each of these incidents had been reported by passengers or witnessed by other employees, and each had been dismissed by supervisors who accepted Craig's explanations without question or deeper investigation. The documentation showed Craig flagging black passengers at rates that defied statistical probability, suggesting profiling rather than random security screening. Young black men especially faced his scrutiny, with records showing he'd questioned the legitimacy of tickets, demanded additional identification, or called security on black male passengers at 8 times the rate he did for white male passengers in similar demographics. The pattern was undeniable, the racism quantified in spreadsheets and incident reports that had been filed away and forgotten until this investigation forced them into light. Linda Pearson received a suspension without pay and was required to complete extensive bias training before the airline would consider her reinstatement. The investigation found that while her history wasn't as egregious as Craig's, she'd participated in profiling behavior and had failed to question or report Craig's more obvious discrimination despite witnessing it repeatedly. Her suspension sent a message that complicity carried consequences, that remaining silent in the face of injustice made you part of the problem rather than a neutral bystander. Amanda Chen was demoted and removed from any supervisory role, relegated to administrative work that involved no customer contact or authority over other employees. The investigation determined that her failures went beyond this one incident with Terrence. She'd systematically dismissed discrimination complaints, protected problematic employees, and created a culture where bias was tolerated and victims were blamed. Her removal from leadership was necessary not just as punishment but as a prerequisite for cultural change that couldn't happen with her in a position of influence. Janet Rodriguez's integrity was rewarded with a promotion to a newly created role in passenger advocacy and experience. She would have the authority to investigate discrimination complaints, recommend policy changes, and implement training improvements. Her position reported directly to the vice president level, bypassing the middle management that had enabled problems like Craig to persist. The airline recognized that change required empowering people who demonstrated the courage to challenge injustice, giving them authority to make the improvements they'd identified. Derek Williams became the lead trainer for the airline's new anti-discrimination protocols, traveling to hub airports across the country to conduct intensive training sessions. His personal experience as a black man in the industry gave him credibility that outside consultants couldn't match. He spoke authentically about the impact of discrimination, about recognizing implicit bias, about the difference between policy compliance and genuine commitment to equity. His sessions were mandatory for all customer-facing employees, and completion required passing assessments that actually tested understanding rather than just attendance. The independent audit of the airline revealed statistics that shocked even those who'd suspected systemic problems. Across all hub airports, black passengers were flagged for additional screening at rates 8 times higher than white passengers when controlling for all other variables including class of service, destination, and time of travel. First-class black passengers faced particularly intense scrutiny, as if their presence in premium cabins automatically triggered suspicion. The data made the invisible visible, quantifying discrimination that had been dismissed as isolated incidents or unfortunate misunderstandings. The audit also uncovered that complaints were systematically dismissed or buried in bureaucratic processes designed to protect the company rather than address problems. Fewer than 5% of discrimination complaints resulted in any employee discipline, and most investigations consisted of asking the accused employee for their version of events and accepting it without further inquiry. Victims who complained faced subtle retaliation, from being flagged in systems for future flights to having their complaints noted in ways that made them appear difficult or litigious. The entire complaint process was designed to discourage rather than encourage reporting. Training programs existed on paper but in practice were treated as formalities that employees rushed through to check a box. Completion rates were tracked but comprehension wasn't tested. Refresher training happened rarely if at all. The curriculum itself was outdated and ineffective, focusing on legal compliance rather than genuine understanding of bias and its impacts. The training needed complete overhaul, and Derek's appointment was the first step in that transformation. The new airline CEO, brought in after the previous one took early retirement under pressure from the board, met personally with Cassandra to discuss comprehensive reforms. He wasn't just managing a crisis but seemed genuinely committed to change, perhaps recognizing that his own success depended on rebuilding trust the company had destroyed. He implemented every reform Cassandra proposed and invited her to serve on a newly created advisory board that would monitor progress and hold leadership accountable. The board included civil rights leaders, travel industry experts, and former passengers who'd experienced discrimination, ensuring diverse perspectives guided policy development. Terrence's MIT tour finally happened 3 weeks late, but the delay meant arriving on campus as a recognized advocate rather than just another prospective student. The experience was surreal, being stopped for photos and conversations about his story everywhere he went. Some of the attention was positive, people expressing support and admiration for his courage. Some was uncomfortable, people treating him like a symbol rather than a person, asking invasive questions about his trauma as if his pain was public property. MIT administration reached out with an invitation for him to speak at freshman orientation about standing up for justice, recognizing that students needed to hear from peers who demonstrated moral courage. He received invitations to speak at the NAACP Youth Conference, at high schools implementing diversity programs, at corporate events focused on bias training. His calendar filled with opportunities he'd never imagined, his voice suddenly carrying weight because of circumstances he hadn't chosen. The attention was overwhelming, forcing him to learn quickly how to navigate being both a teenager and a public figure, how to protect his privacy while using his platform, how to stay grounded when everything around him had changed. College admissions offices from top universities reached out, some offering guaranteed admission, others extending invitations to visit and meet with administrators. The attention was flattering but also troubling, making Terrence wonder if they were interested in him or in the publicity his enrollment would generate. He appreciated the recognition but wanted to be valued for his academic achievements and potential rather than just his viral moment. He stayed committed to MIT, where his mother's legacy had begun and where he felt his future could unfold on his own terms rather than defined entirely by this incident. Some friendships deepened through the experience, friends who checked in regularly, who asked how he was really doing, who treated him the same as before despite the attention. Other friendships faded, people made uncomfortable by his newfound prominence or who revealed problematic views when discussing his situation. He learned that crisis reveals character, both his own and others, showing him who could be trusted with vulnerability and who needed to be kept at a distance. The civil lawsuit was settled for a 7-figure amount that Terrence insisted be donated to racial justice organizations rather than kept as personal compensation. He didn't want money from his humiliation, didn't want to profit from pain. He wanted the settlement to fund change, to support other victims, to contribute to the systemic transformation that would prevent future Terrences from facing what he'd endured. The settlement also included commitments to ongoing reforms, monitoring, and accountability that were worth more than any monetary payment. Criminal charges were filed against Craig Morrison for filing false police reports, the fabricated incident reports meeting the legal definition of providing false information to law enforcement. The charges sent a message that lying to justify discrimination carried consequences beyond employment termination, that abusing authority to harm others was a crime rather than just a policy violation. Craig's case proceeded through the legal system, and while outcomes remained uncertain, the mere fact of prosecution represented progress. Terrence started a blog called Traveling While Black, where he shared his story and invited others to contribute their experiences. The platform became a resource and community, a space where people could tell their stories without judgment, where patterns became visible through collective testimony, where isolated incidents revealed themselves as systemic problems. The blog attracted thousands of followers within weeks, becoming a repository of evidence that discrimination in travel wasn't rare or exceptional but common and predictable. His debate skills found new application in advocacy, crafting arguments for policy change, articulating the case for reform, persuading skeptics that problems were real and solutions were necessary. The experience of being on a debate team prepared him for the intellectual rigor required but couldn't prepare him for the emotional weight of arguing for his own humanity and that of people who looked like him. He learned to balance analytical distance with authentic emotion, to use both logic and lived experience to make compelling cases for justice. His college application essay about the experience was raw and honest, exploring not just what happened but how it changed him, how it forced growth he hadn't sought, how it revealed both the worst and best of humanity. The essay showed vulnerability alongside strength, processing trauma while demonstrating resilience, acknowledging pain while refusing to be defined by it. Admissions officers who read it saw not just a student who'd faced adversity but a young person with the self-awareness and communication skills to transform experience into insight. Therapy helped Terence process the trauma that didn't disappear just because justice was being served or reforms were being implemented. He worked through feelings of violation, anger, shame that shouldn't exist but did, fear that this would happen again despite all the changes being made. His therapist helped him understand that healing wasn't linear, that having bad days didn't negate progress, that taking care of his mental health was as important as advocating for systemic change. Family support proved crucial throughout the process. Cassandra shared her own ongoing experiences with racism in the corporate world, the daily microaggressions that accumulated despite her success and status. His father, a prominent civil rights attorney who'd been traveling during the initial incident, provided a different perspective on legal strategy and systemic change. Family unity strengthened through their collective activism, their shared commitment to turning this painful experience into meaningful progress. 6 months after that terrible morning at Charlotte Douglas International Airport, Terence Baldwin stood in line at the same terminal, boarding a flight to MIT for the fall semester he'd deferred to focus on advocacy work. The gate area looked the same physically, but everything else had changed in ways both visible and invisible. The gate agent, a young black woman whose name tag identified her as Diamond, processed his boarding pass with professional efficiency and then looked up with recognition in her eyes. She thanked him quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, saying that his story had inspired her to report discrimination she'd witnessed from a colleague. That report led to an investigation that resulted in a colleague's termination and protected future passengers from similar treatment. The first-class cabin Terence boarded showed more diversity than statistics from 6 months earlier would have predicted, a visible result of the targeted reforms and monitoring that had been implemented. Passengers of all races occupied premium seats without the suspicious scrutiny that had been routine before. Flight attendants had been trained differently, empowered to intervene when they witnessed potential discrimination rather than deferring to gate agents or security. The culture shift wasn't complete, but progress was measurable and meaningful. Terence settled into his seat and allowed himself to reflect on the journey from victim to advocate, from the lowest point of his life to this moment of hard-won peace. The Equitable Skies initiative now operated in 12 major airports across the country, staffed by attorneys and advocates who provided free legal representation to travelers facing discrimination. The organization had helped 43 people fight discrimination cases in its first 6 months, winning settlements and policy changes that rippled beyond individual victims. 3 airlines had proactively reached out to adopt the protocols Cassandra and her team developed, recognizing that addressing bias was both morally right and economically smart. Derek Williams had become a nationally recognized expert on anti-discrimination training, his methods adopted not just by airlines but by other industries facing similar challenges. He developed assessment tools that actually measured understanding rather than just attendance, created scenarios that forced employees to confront their own biases rather than just intellectually acknowledging that bias existed. His training sessions were intense and sometimes uncomfortable, but they produced measurable changes in behavior and outcomes that validated the approach. Janet Rodriguez had risen to Vice President of Passenger Experience, a position with real authority to investigate complaints and implement changes. She'd streamlined the complaint process, making it easier for passengers to report problems and harder for airlines to dismiss those reports. She'd created transparency in how complaints were handled, publishing quarterly reports that showed what was reported, what was investigated, what actions resulted. The transparency created accountability that had been absent when discrimination could be hidden in internal processes. Craig Morrison's criminal case had resulted in a conviction for filing false reports, with a sentence that included community service requirements and participation in a restorative justice program. As part of that program, he was required to meet with some of the passengers he discriminated against, to hear directly how his actions had impacted their lives, to sit with the discomfort of facing people he'd dehumanized. Whether this would lead to genuine transformation or just performed remorse remained to be seen, but at minimum it represented accountability that victims rarely received. Linda Pearson completed her bias training and returned to work in a non-customer-facing role, processing paperwork and handling administrative tasks that didn't involve direct passenger contact. Some who knew her history said she'd demonstrated genuine change, that the training and suspension had created real reflection and growth. Others remained skeptical, noting that people often changed behavior to keep jobs without changing underlying beliefs. Time would tell which assessment was accurate. Amanda Chen had left the airline industry entirely, taking a position in hotel hospitality where her supervisory failures hopefully wouldn't be repeated. Her departure represented recognition that some damage to credibility and trust couldn't be repaired, that sometimes the best outcome was for problematic leaders to move on rather than trying to rebuild in spaces they'd harmed. The reality was that not everyone changed, that some people completed training without internalizing lessons, that bias was stubborn and persistent even in the face of consequences. But the systems were better equipped to prevent harm now, with monitoring that flagged patterns before they accumulated to crisis levels, with complaint processes that actually worked, with oversight that couldn't be manipulated by those being overseen. Perfect was impossible, but better was achievable and worth pursuing. Terence's Traveling While Black platform had grown to 50,000 followers, a community of people sharing experiences and supporting each other through the exhausting labor of navigating spaces that weren't designed with them in mind. The stories collected there became teaching tools, evidence in discrimination cases, data points in studies examining the scope and impact of racial profiling. What started as one teenager's blog had evolved into a movement, a resource, a testament to the power of collective voice. He'd published a collection of essays drawing from the blog and his own experiences, with proceeds donated to racial justice organizations doing the work of systemic change. The book became required reading in some college courses examining modern racism, used in corporate training programs, discussed in book clubs struggling with how to talk about race. His words reached people he'd never meet, planted seeds of understanding in minds previously closed, challenged assumptions that had gone unexamined. Cassandra's company Tech Vision Industries had implemented what experts called the most comprehensive diversity program in the tech industry, serving as a model for other companies trying to move beyond performative commitments to measurable change. She'd used her platform as CEO to push other industry leaders toward similar reforms, leveraging her business relationships to create pressure for progress. Her work extended far beyond the airline industry, addressing bias in hiring, promotion, product development, in every aspect of how technology companies operated. Mother and son had co-authored an op-ed in the New York Times about the generational nature of fighting racism, about how Cassandra's battles hadn't prevented Terence from facing his own but had equipped him to fight back rather than accept injustice silently. They wrote about the exhaustion of constantly having to prove their worth, the psychological toll of perpetual scrutiny, the hope that came from seeing systems change in response to sustained pressure. Their words resonated with readers across demographics, generating conversations in homes and workplaces about privilege, bias, and responsibility. Terence had been accepted to MIT with a full scholarship, planning to study engineering and public policy with the goal of using technology to identify and prevent discrimination in real time. He dreamed of developing AI systems that could flag bias patterns before they harmed people, that could create accountability through data, that could make invisible prejudice visible and therefore addressable. His experience had shaped his career path in ways he couldn't have predicted, transforming pain into purpose and trauma into mission. The video that had gone viral, the recording of his humiliation that had been viewed millions of times, now served as a teaching tool in bias training programs nationwide. Schools used it to discuss racial profiling with students, analyzing what went wrong and what should have happened instead. Corporations screened it in diversity sessions, forcing employees to confront the real-world impact of assumptions and biases. What had been a moment of deep shame had become an instrument of education, reaching people who might never have understood the reality of discrimination without seeing it documented so clearly. Terrence sometimes watched the video himself, usually late at night when he couldn't sleep and needed to process lingering emotions. It still hurt to see himself so vulnerable, so powerless in that moment, reduced to an object of suspicion rather than recognized as a person deserving dignity. But he also saw how far he'd come from that devastated teenager on the airport floor, saw the growth that trauma had forced, saw the impact his response had created. The video was a reminder of both the worst moment of his life and the catalyst for some of his proudest achievements. His final public appearance of the summer before starting college was a TEDx talk at MIT, delivering his message on the same campus where his mother had developed the skills and connections that built her empire. Terrence stood on that stage before an audience of students, faculty, and community members, telling his story with the polish of someone who'd learned to transform personal pain into powerful narrative. He shared the full experience from the initial humiliation through the ongoing work of creating change, holding the audience in rapt attention through every word. He ended with a message that captured both the reality of ongoing struggle and the possibility of progress. They tried to ground me because of my skin color, to clip my wings before I could fly. Instead, they taught me to soar higher than I'd ever imagined possible. They showed me that injustice only wins when good people stay silent, when victims accept their treatment, when systems go unchallenged. Every moment of pain became fuel for purpose. Every instance of discrimination became evidence for reform. Every attempt to diminish me became motivation to rise. The standing ovation lasted several minutes, but more importantly, the conversation sparked by his words continued long after the applause faded. Young black students approached afterward, some sharing their own stories of discrimination, others expressing gratitude for seeing someone who looked like them refuse to accept less than they deserved. The cycle continued as it always does. Listening, validating, empowering, organizing, creating community and collective power from individual experiences. Terrence realized that his journey wasn't unique but rather one thread in a larger tapestry of resistance and resilience that stretched back generations and would continue forward. Cassandra watched from the audience, tears streaming down her face in a rare public display of emotion. She'd built a billion-dollar company, appeared on magazine covers, spoken at international conferences, but nothing compared to the pride she felt watching her son transform his worst experience into a catalyst for change. The fight against racism was never over, would likely continue throughout both their lifetimes, but moments like this made every battle worthwhile. Her son hadn't just survived his trauma but had used it to make the world slightly better, and what more could any parent hope for? Terrence's closing thought, shared with the audience and with himself, captured the essence of what the past 6 months had taught him: one moment of injustice became a movement for change. That's the power we all have when we refuse to accept the unacceptable, when we channel pain into purpose, when we demand that systems serve justice rather than convenience. My story is one among millions, but if my voice can amplify others, if my platform can create space for those without one, if my experience can prevent someone else's trauma, then every difficult moment was worth it. We don't get to choose what happens to us, but we get to choose what we do with what happens. I chose to fight back, to speak up, to demand better. And you can too. What started as the worst day of Terrence Baldwin's life had transformed into a defining moment that shaped his purpose, clarified his values, and launched him into advocacy he'd never planned but now couldn't imagine abandoning. The teenager who'd been banned from first class for looking suspicious had become a powerful voice for justice, and the CEO mother who'd landed her plane just in time had channeled her fury into systemic change that would outlast them both. Together they proved that sometimes the people who try to hold you down end up pushing you higher than you ever would have climbed on your own. So what do you think about this incredible journey from humiliation to transformation? Drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever experienced or witnessed discrimination like what Terrence faced. Hit that like button if you believe in holding people accountable for racial profiling and other forms of injustice. Make sure you subscribe to this channel because stories like this need to be shared, discussed, and remembered. And share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Thank you for watching this powerful story of resilience, advocacy, and the kind of love that moves mountains. Remember, change happens when we refuse to stay silent. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and keep fighting for a world where everyone is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other. This powerful story reveals critical truths about confronting injustice in America today. First, documentation matters immensely. The viral video provided irrefutable evidence that protected Terrence from false narratives and sparked nationwide accountability. Second, allies who speak up make tremendous differences. Janet and Derek risked their careers to stand for what was right, proving that silence enables discrimination while courage disrupts it. Third, individual incidents reflect systemic problems. Craig's pattern of bias existed because institutions protected him rather than passengers. Real change requires addressing root causes, not just punishing individual actors. Fourth, privilege carries responsibility. Cassandra used her resources and platform not just to defend her son but to create lasting reforms benefiting countless others. Fifth, pain can become purpose when channeled toward advocacy. Terrence transformed his trauma into a movement that prevented others from suffering similarly. Sixth, accountability requires transparency and monitoring. Policies mean nothing without enforcement mechanisms and public reporting. Seventh, youth voices matter in justice movements. Terrence's perspective as someone directly impacted brought authenticity that adult advocates couldn't replicate. Finally, change happens through sustained pressure, not single moments. The reforms achieved required legal action, media attention, corporate pressure, and community organizing working together. Justice demands persistence, courage, strategic thinking, and collective action. One person speaking truth can spark movements, but movements require many people choosing solidarity over comfort. Have you or someone you know ever experienced racial profiling in airports, stores, or other public spaces? Share your story in the comments below because your voice matters and your experience deserves to be heard. If this story moved you or opened your eyes to the reality of discrimination that millions face daily, show your support by hitting that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss stories about courage, justice, and people fighting back against systems designed to keep them down. Share this video with your friends, family, and social networks because stories like Terrence's need to reach everyone, especially those who've never experienced this kind of treatment and need to understand it's real. Thank you for watching, for listening, for caring enough to stay until the end. Your attention to these stories matters more than you know. May you always have the courage to stand up for what's right, the wisdom to recognize injustice when you see it, and the strength to support those fighting battles you might never face yourself. Together, we can create a world where every person is judged by their character rather than their appearance. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and keep demanding better from the systems that serve us all.